Henry VIII ruled England through fear, through obedience, through the knowledge that a single word from him could end a life. Queens lost their heads. Ministers vanished overnight. Even the church bent beneath his will. But there was one person Henry could never truly control. Not with threats. Not with marriages. Not even with rage. His sister. Margaret Tudor ruled no empire of terror. She commanded no executioners. She signed no death warrants dripping with blood. Instead, she ruled through intelligence, through patience, through a quiet, relentless understanding of power that her brother never mastered. Now imagine her at just 13 years old. A girl wrapped in silk and jewels, trained to smile perfectly while her heart fractured beneath the weight of duty. Around her, courtiers praised her beauty, her grace, never asking if she was afraid. Because Margaret already knew the truth. She was not being married. She was being traded. A living treaty. A peace offering wrapped in velvet. England and Scotland, enemies for centuries, would be bound together through her body, her womb, and her obedience. And she understood something crucial, even then. This marriage was meant to control her. But Margaret Tudor would not be controlled. While Henry VIII would later shatter wives to maintain power over England, his sister would quietly bend kingdoms, shaping Scotland, surviving political storms, and defying her brother again and again. She would outlive his fury, outmaneuver his commands, and leave behind a legacy Henry tried and failed to erase. This is the story of the woman who escaped the shadow of England's most dangerous king, the sister he could never dominate. So, the question remains, how did the man who controlled everyone fail to control his own sister? The Tudor dynasty was born in fear. It began on a battlefield at Bosworth Field, where Henry VII seized a crown that still felt warm with someone else's blood. From that moment on, the Tudors understood one brutal truth: power taken by force can always be taken away again. So, paranoia became policy. Every marriage was calculated. Every birth was political. Every child was a potential threat or a potential weapon. In this world, royal daughters were not raised as people. They were raised as solutions. They existed to end wars, seal alliances, quiet borders, and soothe enemies who had been killing Englishmen for generations. Their bodies were treaties. Their wombs were negotiations. And no Tudor daughter escaped that fate. Henry, the son, was raised to rule. From the moment he could walk, he was taught that England belonged to him. He learned how to command men, how to inspire loyalty, how to believe the crown was his by divine right. Margaret, the daughter, was raised to be useful. Her education was meticulous: languages, music, manners, diplomacy, not to free her mind, but to discipline it. Every lesson carried an unspoken warning: you will not choose your future. You will serve it. This was not empowerment. It was preparation for sacrifice. Margaret learned how to smile while listening, how to speak without revealing thought, how to absorb insult without reacting, how to read rooms filled with men who would decide her fate without ever asking her opinion. And the system was ruthless. A woman who obeyed was praised as virtuous. A woman who thought was labeled dangerous. A woman who resisted was punished. The true villain of Margaret Tudor's story is not a single king or a single marriage. It is a political machine that demanded absolute loyalty and silence from women while quietly fearing their intelligence. Because an educated woman might understand the game, and a woman who understood the game might learn how to play it better than the men who designed it. Margaret Tudor was being trained to be a weapon. What no one realized yet, not even her brother, was that she would eventually turn that weapon back on the system itself. Margaret Tudor's education was meant to make her obedient. Instead, it made her dangerous. Her days were filled with lessons designed to polish her into perfection: languages spoken softly, prayers recited flawlessly, music played with precise emotion. Latin and French slipped easily from her tongue. Court etiquette became second nature: when to speak, when to pause, when silence carried more power than words. She learned how to enter a room without commanding it, and how to leave without being forgotten. On the surface, this was the standard education of a royal daughter. But beneath it, Margaret was learning something else entirely. She was learning how men lie in politics. She noticed how promises changed depending on who was listening. How loyalty dissolved the moment power shifted. How smiles often concealed calculation, and how compliments were frequently disguised commands. She watched envoys flatter kings while whispering different truths to queens. She observed how decisions were made long before councils met, and how the meetings themselves were theater. Margaret learned that charm disarms power. A gentle laugh could soften a threat. A well-timed silence could unsettle a confident man. Appearing harmless was often the greatest advantage of all. And she learned that information travels faster than armies. Secrets slipped through corridors more efficiently than soldiers crossed borders. A rumor, carefully placed, could weaken alliances. A private confession could alter negotiations. Knowledge, she realized, was currency, and she was surrounded by men who spent it carelessly. Quietly, without defiance or drama, Margaret absorbed it all. She was not just learning how to survive court life. She was learning how power actually worked. No one noticed, because Margaret never challenged the role assigned to her. She never spoke out of turn. She never demanded authority. She simply became very, very good at understanding those who believed they possessed it. And in that silence, a dangerous truth took shape. Margaret Tudor was smarter than the role she had been given. Smarter than the system intended. And one day, when she crossed the border into Scotland, she would bring that knowledge with her, not as a bride, but as a player in a game she already understood far better than anyone realized. Scotland was not just another kingdom. To England, it was the ancient enemy. For centuries, the northern border had burned with raids, reprisals, and bloodshed. Families on both sides had grown up expecting violence as a fact of life. Peace was not trusted. It was temporary, fragile, almost unnatural. And yet, the Tudors believed they had found a solution. It was called the Treaty of Perpetual Peace. The name was hopeful, almost naive. The terms were simple: England and Scotland would end their wars, not through shared values or mutual respect, but through marriage. Margaret Tudor would be the price. When the decision was made, no one asked how she felt. There was no council debate about her happiness. No private conversation seeking her consent. The treaty was signed first. The marriage arranged second. Margaret was informed last. She was still a child. Old enough to understand what was happening. Young enough to feel completely powerless to stop it. Fear settled in first. She had been raised on stories of Scottish brutality, of border raids, of treacherous kings, of a land that had resisted English dominance for generations. Now she was expected to leave everything she knew and live among people trained to resent her very blood. Then came resentment. Not toward Scotland, but toward England. Toward the family that claimed to love her while quietly offering her up as payment. Toward the brother who would soon wear the crown, learning already that power required sacrifice, as long as it was someone else making it. Henry's decision was final. No discussion. No consent. No alternative. This was the moment Margaret understood something she would never forget. Loyalty did not protect you. Obedience did not save you. Being useful only delayed the knife. As preparations for her departure began, Margaret smiled in public as she had been trained to do. She accepted the jewels, the dresses, the ceremonial praise. But privately, something shifted. This was the day Margaret Tudor stopped believing the system would reward her loyalty. And from this moment forward, she would begin planning not how to serve power, but how to survive it. Margaret Tudor crossed the border into Scotland carrying more than her dowry. She carried a belief, a fragile, dangerous belief, that she could be both English and Scottish, that she could marry James IV and still maintain the loyalty of her homeland, that she could act as a diplomatic bridge between two centuries-old enemies. that she could somehow wield influence with both crowns without ever seeming to betray either. At first, this belief felt like power. She arrived in a foreign court, draped in jewels and velvet, her every movement studied by spies and courtiers alike. She spoke the language of diplomacy fluently. She learned the rhythms of the Scottish court. She smiled politely, flattered the nobles, and remembered every detail, every insult, every slight, every unspoken alliance. She was prepared. And yet, the danger was invisible. Because a woman trusted by no one is always expendable. Every smile could be mistaken for ambition. Every word of caution could be twisted into conspiracy. Every gesture meant to build bridges could be viewed as betrayal. Margaret was walking a tightrope suspended over centuries of mistrust. The fatal flaw in her plan? She believed that loyalty, intelligence, and charm could protect her. But in a court where suspicion was law and allegiance shifted like the wind, trust was a luxury no one could afford her. The crown she wore around her neck promised security. The crown above her head reminded her of fragility. And so, quietly, Margaret Tudor began learning the hardest lesson of all. Power and survival are rarely the same thing. She would need to be clever, patient, and utterly ruthless, but she could not yet know how dangerous the cost of her belief would become. James IV was not the enemy Margaret had been taught to fear. He was intelligent, curious about the world, respectful of ideas he had never heard from women before. From the moment she stepped into the Scottish court, Margaret sensed a subtle shift. Where England had trained her to obey, Scotland seemed to listen. Her education, languages, diplomacy, etiquette, suddenly became a weapon. She attended councils quietly, absorbing every argument. She translated letters between English and Scottish nobles, often anticipating their intentions before they themselves realized them. She advised policy, always careful, always measured, but always influential. Margaret's growth was silent but unstoppable. She learned how to bend politics without breaking protocol, how to shape decisions through persuasion rather than force. Every move she made expanded her sphere of influence. Contrast sharpened itself in every meeting. England, daughters confined to beauty, obedience, and silence. Scotland, a queen's intelligence could sway the realm. Her brother, Henry VIII, had trained to dominate through fear. His courts demanded submission, rewarded loyalty, punished thought. Margaret had been taught the same rules, and then she broke them quietly, cleverly, and permanently. This girl, traded for peace, underestimated by kings, underestimated by men, is becoming powerful in a way Henry never anticipated. Every council she attended, every letter she translated, every policy she influenced quietly shifted the balance of power. Margaret Tudor was no longer just a pawn in England's games. She was a player. And in Scotland, the first whispers of her real power began to spread, slowly, invisibly, and irreversibly. Margaret Tudor had transformed. No longer the traded princess, no longer the obedient pawn. She had become a political broker, a force operating quietly, but with precision sharp enough to cut through centuries of rivalry. The birth of her son, James V, changed everything. Suddenly, she wasn't just a queen. She was a mother of the heir, a linchpin of succession whose influence extended far beyond courtly ceremonies. Every decision, every negotiation, every treaty passed through her hands, directly or indirectly. She controlled the most powerful levers in Scotland: succession, shaping the future of the kingdom through her son; access, determining who could speak to the king, who could petition, who could be seen; information, gathering intelligence from courtiers, letters, envoys, and translating it into advantage. Henry VIII, confident in his ability to command, attempted to exert influence. He sent letters. He demanded loyalty. He reminded her of bloodlines, of obligation, of power. Margaret responded not with defiance, but with calculated truth. She gave him information, but never all of it. She honored duty, but only on her terms. She obeyed when it served her and withheld when it didn't. The dynamic had shifted entirely. The sister who had once been silently traded for a treaty was now a queen who could manipulate kingdoms. Henry's problem was no longer distance or diplomacy. It was Margaret herself. The girl he could not control as a child, the pawn he believed he could move at will, had become a queen he could not command. She was no longer part of his game. She had become its most unpredictable player. And in every careful word, every discreet action, every subtle maneuver, Margaret Tudor reminded the world, and Henry VIII, that power cannot be inherited. Sometimes power is learned, and sometimes it is earned by those who were never meant to have it. For years, Margaret Tudor had walked a tightrope between crowns. Every letter she sent, every meeting she arranged, was an attempt at diplomacy, a careful balance between England and Scotland, between her brother and her husband, between loyalty and survival. But the world she had built was fragile. Henry VIII ignored her warnings. He dismissed her counsel, confident that his armies, his titles, his fear could control events across the border. He believed that bloodlines and obedience would be enough. Margaret knew better. Tensions between England and Scotland rose, thickening like storm clouds over a summer horizon. Borders were fortified. Alliances whispered in secret. And then, inevitably, war erupted. James IV invaded England, carrying with him the ambitions Margaret had tried to temper. She had hoped to prevent this. She had worked tirelessly to guide decisions toward peace. But diplomacy faltered against the momentum of kings and generals determined to prove themselves. And then came Flodden Field. A single day etched in fire and blood. James was killed. Scottish leadership was decimated. The army that had once marched with confidence was gone, a ruin of strategy and human lives scattered across the battlefield. Margaret Tudor emerged from the carnage widowed, regent, and surrounded by enemies on all sides. The fragile balance she had cultivated was obliterated. The treaties, the marriages, the careful negotiations, none of it could shield her from the collapse that centuries of mistrust had made inevitable. She stood at the center of a kingdom fractured, a monarchy grieving, a people trembling, yet she remained. The sister Henry could not control had survived the destruction. But survival now required more than intelligence or charm. It required strategy, courage, and a willingness to wield power in a world that had proven itself merciless. Margaret Tudor had learned the game. Now she had to win it. Margaret Tudor faced a choice no one envied. Her brother's England beckoned with familiarity, with blood ties and old loyalties. But Scotland, fractured, grieving, and leaderless, demanded her presence, her intelligence, and her courage. She chose Scotland. Standing in the Great Hall, with infant James V cradled in her arms, Margaret delivered a speech that would define her reign. Every word was deliberate, every gesture measured. Courtiers listened in silence, nobles leaned forward, and even wary clansmen paused their scheming to hear the voice of the Queen Regent. She did not wield a sword. She did not demand obedience with threats. She wielded strategy. Through careful diplomacy, she balanced the interests of England, the ambitions of France, and the unpredictability of Scottish clans. Every alliance was meticulously managed, every conflict mitigated before it could explode. She became the pivot around which kingdoms turned. Margaret's greatest victory was not born in battle. It was born in calm authority, in subtle influence, in the ability to act decisively while appearing measured and controlled. Henry VIII, who had believed he could dominate his sister through bloodlines, treaties, and fear, was left powerless. Every move he made in England could be anticipated, countered, or rendered irrelevant by Margaret's foresight. She had outmaneuvered him completely. A girl once traded for peace had become the guardian of a kingdom, the mother of a king, and the most formidable political player of her era. And in that quiet, deliberate triumph, Margaret Tudor cemented her place in history, not as a pawn, not as a daughter, not as a sister, but as a queen who rewrote the rules of power entirely on her own terms. Even the cleverest players are human. Margaret Tudor had survived treaties, wars, and betrayals. She had outmaneuvered kings. She had shaped the fate of nations. And yet, loneliness haunted her. Years of vigilance, of smiling while hearts broke and letters carried secrets, left her craving connection, not power, not strategy, but someone to stand beside her in a world that demanded calculation above all else. Fear lingered too. Fear for her son, for her position, for the fragile peace she had worked so hard to maintain. And pressure, relentless, political, and suffocating, bore down from every direction. From Scottish nobles, from clans, from England, and from Henry himself. In that human moment, Margaret made a choice. She married Archibald Douglas, a man she loved, a choice that defied the cold calculus of kingdoms. The consequences were swift and unforgiving. Her regency was stripped, her influence curtailed, her carefully balanced alliances destabilized. Trust, both in Scotland and with England, fractured almost overnight. Even Henry, enraged beyond measure, recognized that his sister's independence had become more dangerous than her obedience ever could have been. This was the ultimate paradox of Margaret Tudor. Her intelligence had saved kingdoms. Her humanity had cost her power. She had bent nations to her will. She had survived what most rulers could not. And yet, in choosing love over control, she reminded the world and herself that even queens are not machines, and even the strongest strategies cannot eliminate the heart's desires. Margaret Tudor remained formidable, resilient, and clever, but forever human, navigating the fine line between power and personal truth. Margaret Tudor had dared to play a game most women of her era could never even imagine. And like all trailblazers, she faced consequences. Henry VIII, furious at her independence, cut off support. Letters of guidance and backing that might have protected her vanished. Treaties that once offered security were ignored. Her brother's power, once a safety net, became a threat. In Scotland, those who had once watched her carefully, learned from her decisions, and deferred to her wisdom now sideline her. Courtiers whispered behind doors. Nobles questioned her judgment. The alliances she had painstakingly built wavered under pressure. Margaret became politically toxic. To challenge her was dangerous, to support her was risky. Her influence, once nearly absolute in the regency, dwindled as fear and resentment replaced respect. Even her son, James V, who had once been her leverage and her joy, was turned against her. Counselors shaped his perception, and the child king began to see the mother who had guided him not as protector, but as obstacle. And so, step by step, history itself began to forget Margaret Tudor on purpose. Chroniclers minimized her achievements. The narratives that survived emphasized obedience, not cunning. Her victories were muted. Her defiance erased. The sister Henry could not control had become invisible, punished not with swords or poison, but with silence. Yet beneath this quiet erasure, the truth remained. Margaret had outmaneuvered kings, survived wars, and altered the course of history. She had been erased for her independence, a warning and a testament to the cost of intelligence wielded without compromise. Margaret Tudor's life ended quietly. No grand funeral. No statues erected in her honor. No songs sung to immortalize her name. The world moved on, largely unaware of the woman who had navigated the storms of kings, wars, and betrayal with unmatched intelligence. And yet, in silence, her greatest victory had already been won. Her bloodline, the line she had safeguarded, nurtured, and defended, would unite England and Scotland in ways Henry VIII could never have imagined. Generations later, crowns would merge, and centuries of rivalry would bend under the weight of a single, carefully played life. Henry VIII ruled through fear. His power was immediate, visible, and terrifying. His enemies bowed, his wives obeyed, his ministers trembled. But fear has a shelf life. It does not survive beyond the ruler who wields it. Margaret ruled through legacy, through strategy, patience, and subtle influence, she shaped nations long after her death. The treaties, marriages, and alliances she forged were not written on parchment alone, they were etched into the bloodlines of kings and queens, in the hearts of nations, in the very course of history. While Henry demanded obedience, Margaret earned remembrance. And though her name may have been minimized by historians of her time, the results of her intelligence, courage, and resilience endured far beyond any throne or decree. The sister Henry could not control had won, not through fear, not through force, but through the quiet, unstoppable power of legacy. And that is the story Henry never lived to see. Margaret Tudor did not lose. Though her life was shaped by marriages, betrayals, and wars, she emerged as a master of the game she had been forced to play. She did not simply survive the ambitions of kings, the treachery of courts, or the constraints of a patriarchal system. She changed the rules entirely. She proved, quietly but unmistakably, that women could think strategically, rule effectively, and defy kings without breaking. Every letter she translated, every council she influenced, every diplomatic choice she made was a subtle lesson in power. Intelligence, patience, and courage could surpass brute force and fear. Her story is not one of revenge or conquest. It is one of endurance, strategy, and legacy. She demonstrated that true influence often moves silently, invisibly, but leaves marks that last for generations. And so, as history slowly remembered her achievements, it became clear, Margaret Tudor didn't just survive her brother. She outsmarted him. She didn't merely outlive Henry VIII, she outplayed him.